In this video we're going to consider Pestle. Now this is a macro environmental analysis technique. Well, actually in fact it's not really a technique, it's more a list of environmental points that impinge upon the organization. So it's really a catalogue of points and issues that will affect the organization. So it's not really an analysis as such. Each of the factors we can identify as important in the context of the organization and that will affect the organization, they may be analyzed to see in what ways they can affect them and why they're affecting the organization. But as a technique itself, it's not really analytical. It's more a list of points that affect the organization. So what I'm going to do in these slides is to look at various factors that impact on the organization and just have a few words about each of them. It's Pestle, so we'll go through them according to the Pestle anagram that we've got here. So if we start, for example, we'll look at the political and legal issues, and we'll see from the word Pestle, this is the P and the L factors there. So what legal and political factors may affect a business organization? Well, taxation policy. The government controls taxation. The government's got a right to levy taxes, and the taxes it imposes will affect the organization, either directly through corporation tax or value added tax or some issue like that, or it'll affect the organization indirectly. Perhaps it imposes a tax on the population, the working population. That means that working people have less to spend. That will impact upon sales of the organization. So taxation policy is clearly important. But the government also looks out for monopolies and the emergence of monopolies. A monopoly means a single seller of a product in economics. In practice, it's a very large firm who exercises a lot of market power. Typically something over 25% of the market, or around 25% of the market. So if a company has around that figure, it's deemed to have monopoly power. And this may attract the attention of the government. It may want to break up the company so that smaller producers become involved in making the product or offering the service, and thereby there's more competition. More competition is held to be good, because prices are competed downwards and customers have better treatment from the producer. So by and large, we don't like the emergence of monopolies. We prefer to see competitive markets. We have to be careful, of course, because monopolies can have a positive side as well. For example, companies make excess profits and may be able to research and develop into new products. This could be particularly important in the case of medicine, for example, and the ethical pharmaceutical drugs business, where we depend upon new discoveries and new medications. And of course they can only be financed by big companies who make a lot of profit. It's also the case, of course, that large companies are able to compete more effectively in world markets, and we like companies from the country in which we live to be able to compete effectively overseas. So there are positive sides associated with monopoly, but this obviously is the subject matter of separate videos in economics on the topic of monopoly. But by and large, the governments may watch for the emergence of monopoly and may not condone monopolies in many markets, and may in fact break up the companies so that they operate as much smaller entities and are hence more competitive. We also have the government, of course, imposing environmental protection measures. There is quite a strong green lobby now in many countries who are acutely aware of the damage that we've inflicted on the environment through greenhouse gases and global warming and rising sea levels. And governments try to regulate output of industry, particularly outputs that are environmentally damaging, but also try to encourage industrialists to be more efficient in their use of energy. So that's another issue that may impact upon business. Employment law, of course, is one which is fairly obvious because the terms of contracts, employment contracts, must conform to the law of the land, and the law of the land may state that people are entitled to certain amounts of holidays or sick leave or maternity leave or whatever, and companies must go along with this. So the government sets out employment law that affects the companies. It also, of course, affects the workers. Environmental legislation we've really covered in point 3, but by and large environmental legislation can come from a variety of sources. In the context of the UK, for example, it could be the European Union passing directives which have to be enacted in the UK and acted upon. So there is environmental legislation, and there are also various treaties that occur from time to time where governments from right around the world meet and set limits to the amount of emissions that we produce, and this will affect industry, but we could argue, of course, it is for the good of all of us and for the good of future generations. We also have foreign trade agreements. Governments do draw up agreements with other countries, and this may lead to imports from those countries, but it may also create export opportunities into those countries as well. So we have foreign trade agreements drawn up by governments. And lastly, in terms of this particular talk, there's the stability of the government system itself. We look to governments to be stable. We look to governments to take power and to rule in a benign manner and in accordance with their promises, and to operate openly and honestly, without corruption and without malice towards any particular section of the community, or without malice towards industry or organised labour for that matter. So we want fairness, and we want to see the situation within countries developing under control. We want the government to have the situation under control, so we have some sort of certainty in our lives. We don't want to wake up every morning to the prospect of a revolution and entering a phase that we don't know what's expected of us, or what the outcomes will be, or how it will affect us or our families. So stability of government is also a very important issue. Now if we move to the second point in the Pestle word E for economic factors. Well, economic factors that affect the business could be interest rates. Now these are determined by central banks, and are determined by forces in the market, monetary forces in the market, forces for the supply and demand for money, and also in line with government policy towards controlling inflation, for example. So interest rates, when they rise, means the cost of borrowing increases. That will affect companies. It will also affect savers. If their interest rates rise, people may save more in the banks, which means they don't spend as much. That will affect companies as well. So interest rates are an important consideration, and certainly we could expect investment expenditure to be sensitive to interest rates. If interest rates are high and expected to go higher, this may deter investment. Inflation rates are also important. Inflation destroys the market to some extent. It destroys the information in the market. Over a period of time, we all get to know the price of products and where to shop, and we build up information. We do it almost naturally. We do it as a part of our lives. Well, when inflation comes along, that means general prices are rising, and then those signals and that information becomes destroyed. The signals get confused. we're not sure where the best prices are. We're not sure of what the prices will be next week. We're not sure what the impact of inflation is going to be. Now, there are many bad parts associated with inflation and many issues to be looked at in the context of inflation. And to that end, I would direct you on to looking at some of the notes on economics and some of the areas in business environment that considers economic issues, and in particular looks at issues associated with inflation, looking at the costs of inflation and the factors that can be affected by inflation, including industrial development. The money supply and inflation are linked. If the money supply increases, then the quantity of money in the country is increased, therefore money is less scarce, therefore the price of money may fall. Just like supply and demand for anything. If the quantity is increased, the price may fall. And the price of money is the rate of interest. That is the price of money. So the money supply is something that will affect the companies. It could affect the companies through the rate of interest. But it could also affect the companies more directly by making finance more readily available through the banks. So the companies are able to borrow for investment purposes and for expansion purposes more easily. Economies also go through the business cycle. Again, the subject matter of a separate video. But the business cycle, we can imagine it very crudely like a sine wave. We can imagine it as going up to a maximum and then turning down into a depression or into a recession and then turning up again. And left to its own devices, economies enter into those cycles. If the government doesn't do anything, if the government leaves the economy alone, the economy will still go into a boom period and then turn down itself into a recessionary period and then turn up, of its own volition almost, turn up into a boom period. So cycles like this occur. There's a big debate in economics about the length of the cycle. Some cycles have been suggested could be 100 years or longer from start to finish. Other cycles could be 1 year, let's say. So business cycles can influence business. If the economy is entering into a boom period, then the company may anticipate more sales. If the economy is entering into a recession phase, then the company may anticipate less sales. So the business cycle is clearly important. I don't want to get involved in the technicalities of the business cycle in this session. This session is not meant to do that. These are dealt with separately in separate videos. Unemployment is also a factor that's important. When there's a high level of unemployment in the economy, there will be less spending in the economy, and less spending means that the companies will find it difficult to make sales. There will be less disposable income in the economy, so less sales. But unemployment can also have effects in the labour market because it may depress wages in the labour market, which has an effect on companies as well. So unemployment is an issue that needs to be taken into account. And economic trends. Sometimes economic commentators can influence companies just by making statements on television or in the press. Make statements about the future course of the economy. They could say that in their expectation the economy will pick up in the next 6 months and will go through a boom period. Now, if the companies take that seriously, they will then start to invest so they're ready for the boom period when it arrives. However, if enough of them act in this way, of course the prophecy will be self-fulfilling. It will definitely happen because all the companies are spending more and investing more and getting ready for the boom, but in so doing they're causing the boom. So economic trends can influence influence companies and the way the companies act and see the future. Now the social and cultural issues, S. Well, the age profiles of the population. If the population is getting older, there will be a different set of goods required. There may be less sports cars sold and perhaps more holidays by the seaside. So it's aging populations require different sets of goods to younger populations. Younger populations may have children and will demand goods for the children. Older populations don't require those. So clearly the age profile of the population is important for companies to take into account, the so-called demographic factors. Also social mobility. How easy is it for people to move up the social ladder? Is it a society that, for example, discriminates against, let's say, females or against people from different ethnic backgrounds? Is that condoned within the society? Because if it is, then those people are being artificially held back, and they're the ones who perhaps industry needs to promote growth and efficiency and bring about a more dynamic economy. So what's the type of social mobility, and what opportunities are there for people at school to go to college and university and get master's degrees and show off what they can do, and then go on to have good lives and help others in so doing? So social mobility is an issue that needs to be taken seriously, but it does affect companies. The companies themselves may not be able to do anything about it, but it certainly affects the companies in terms of the availability of skilled staff, the opportunities that people get to move through the ranks from, let's say, manual worker to clerical to managerial and so on. And also changes in lifestyles. We have changed our lifestyles immensely. If we look at most economies today and compare it with those economies, let's say 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we have changed immensely. We've changed our lifestyles in terms of the types of food we eat, our holiday patterns, our requirements in the home, the type of electronics and communication systems we've got. And all of these impact on companies as well. We now have home shopping, and we have shopping online, and we have a lot of influences that were not there in the past. Family structure is also important. Whether we've got a nuclear type family with a father, mother and some children, or a single parent, or whatever the configuration is, there will be implications for sales for companies and the way the companies must try to organize their products to try and facilitate the customers coming from different circumstances, to enable those workers to and those consumers, I should say, to fulfill their needs given their personal circumstances. The average level of education is important for companies, not just because they want to recruit the right type of personnel, people with the right skills and competencies and aptitudes, who are able to not just read and write, but are able to program and use spreadsheets and program machines and who have got the capability of integrating into this very technocratic structure that we've developed. But we also need good levels of education to promote society, so that we get a more caring and a more compassionate society, a more understanding society, more tolerance. And this comes through education, the type of respect that we pay each other, and the way in which we live. Worker behaviour is important. Workers have been empowered through various pieces of legislation, and although some people would say probably over empowered, others would say it's right what has happened, and maybe that debate will just continue and that tension will continue between different groups involved in employee relations. But worker behaviour is important so that workers are acculturated to the way in which we need to work nowadays. The global economy makes certain demands of industry in terms of quality requirements, delivery dates, um, the specifications, the functionality, the design of products, um, and all of this requires worker cooperation, and that's a difference as well. We also have different leisure activities, the way we spend our time. More and more people spend time online nowadays. Perhaps in the past they would have gone to the cinema, or they would have gone out in the evening and gone for a meal or whatever, visited family. They may spend more time online, and they may even speak to their family online, uh, uh, conference with their family. Um, it's the world has changed, and the type of products that are required have changed immensely, and it's imperative that industry and commerce understand customer requirements and the changing pattern of customer requirements in the context of work, leisure, and type of family expenditures that we undertake. And it's important that the companies have the products there for us to meet those demands if those companies are going to succeed. The distribution of income is also important, of course. Uh, it's always an issue that it's divisive when we get a few very, very rich people in the society and the vast majority of the people quite poor. Well, in a sense, that's a recipe for revolution almost. That's a recipe for social disorder. Now, probably that's the wrong way of putting it, but certainly to get people to buy in to the society and the norms of the society, they must have a stake in the society. And that means they must feel that they're able to advance themselves and their families through hard work, through education, through application, and through following the rules. So they feel it's very uh, it's detrimental to social cohesion when there's a few very rich and the majority are very poor. So movements towards redistributing income away from the rich and towards the poor means there may be more expenditure on goods and services. The poor tend to spend a higher proportion of their income simply because they have to. They can't afford to save. So the poor may spend 100% of their income. The rich, the very rich, may only spend a very small percentage of their income. So by distributing income away from the rich and in favour of the poor, that will increase overall expenditure in the economy, and that could boost sales for companies and boost the sustainability of companies. Finally, attitudes and values. Well, attitudes and values have also changed over the years. Probably this is a function of the technology that we've seen emerge and the types of changes we've seen in education, and types of changes in society, in social norms in society. But attitudes and values, they need to be supportive of industry if we are to have industry. If a society is aggressive towards industry, then it's likely that the business community will then up and move to a country or to an area where they're more welcomed. That means jobs will be lost and there'll be increased poverty within the area that pushed them out. So there are lots of issues here, and these 9 points are quite controversial. I recognise that, and it's important to get a balance on each of them and try to work through the pros and cons of each of them and get them balanced, because it's probably wrong to come down on one side or the other. There are issues associated with each of them, that tend to be for and against. So try and get a good list, pros and cons associated with this. Let's move to the technological factors. There could be a focus on government research. Government research may be sponsored through particular institutions, or it could be grant payments to universities to undertake particular research, or whatever it is. So we do generally benefit from a lot of this research. Sometimes it's with a considerable lag. The research may be undertaken, for example, for military purposes. But eventually we would expect some sort of spin-off to come out into our lives, perhaps in the form of new products or new materials. As we'll see in a few moments, these are separate issues. The rate of technological transfer, moving from, let's say, from pure research conducted, let's say, at university level, to technological adaptation and into products. That rate is important because that's what gives us new products. So sometimes an idea may be played around with amongst the academics, and or might be played around with amongst researchers in institutions, but eventually it may become a product and go into sale, and that will in turn affect our lifestyles. I just mentioned materials. It could be that the research is aimed at something to achieve something, and a side effect or a side product of this is the development of new materials. A lot of development that's gone on in the past has been what we call serendipity. It's been luck almost. We think of a lot of products that we get have just been developed out of almost pure chance, just coincidence. But we get new materials, new products, new innovations as a consequence of perhaps some other activity. It was a spin-off. It's well worthwhile researching some of these. Apparently LED bulbs was quite accidentally discovered. Now these are very important as energy saving bulbs. Microwave ovens, I think that was these were found, or that particular use was found by accident. But there are many, and these are just spin-offs from other activities. It's important to develop technological processes and have a tolerance towards technological processes. Some traditional companies may wish to remain traditional and work in their own particular way, and that's fine if there is a market for those products. Some, however, will require technological change and will require specialist machinery and specialist personnel, and the rate at which companies adopt these will be important. And it will depend on the training and aptitude of the workers and the availability of the technologies. Environmental factors, the last one, well, green issues and sustainability. These are very important and are becoming more important as we know more about them. The environmental debate has been around for many years, many years. It's only recently that the general public seems to have taken it seriously. Scientists in the past were seen as perhaps scaremongering and just trying to frighten people. But maybe it's the case that we've now at last entered a period where we are worried about emissions and what we're putting into the atmosphere and what's going to happen to the planet in the long run. Of course, also the environmental factors leads us to a consideration of ethical considerations. Production of goods in overseas locations which are undertaken with scant regard to the health and welfare of the workers. These issues need to be emphasized and are being emphasized by campaigners and by organizations. And companies who operate need to have regard for the environment and for the ethical considerations of the products that they're putting on the market and how those products were produced. Now, as I said, these are just some points that relate to a Pestle type discussion. There are separate videos on this, some of them much more elaborate, but it's worth just making a list of these points and making sure that you can go across many of them and discuss them in the context of companies and see how they're relevant in the context of companies. Certainly we should be prepared to discuss these when we discuss the circumstances that companies are confronted with on a daily basis, both in terms of the design of their strategy and also the operational issues that they use. But that's all we're going to deal with here, so let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.